Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 13th, where I wanted to put some closure on A Midsummer Night's Dream. And as you know, I am working my way through the papers. I hope to catch up in the next week or so, as well as with the discussion forum responses. And as you know, with the first paper, everybody has the option of doing a revision. I just ask that you submit in the revised copy along with the original graded version so that I can compare and contrast the two. And you have up until the ending of the semester to do that. So that said, certainly the sooner the better. And if all goes well, I should be all caught up with all of the papers that I have received shortly. And in terms of paper number 2, which is going to be due at the ending of the semester, it's going to be very similar to what you've done with paper number 1, but the difference will be that you will be writing about drama rather than writing about short story or fiction. And if you were to look in the syllabus and other documents folder, you will see that I have posted the questions for paper number 2, which are very similar to the questions for paper number 1, the only difference being on the text that you're writing on. So for paper number 2, which is also going to be a 4 to 5 page paper, critical paper, so you don't need to consult outside resources. And this paper is going to ask you to either talk about either performance or a text. Since we've seen both performances, so that'll be the film portion of the class, but we've also read the text of 3 dramas. Oedipus the King being the first, A Midsummer Night's Dream being the second, and finally what we will be doing for the next several classes, A Raisin in the Sun. So you can elect to either talk about performance or you can talk about text. And your options will be the same options that you had for your first paper, to either identify a performance or text that you think should be included in the literary canon and indicate why, or to identify a performance or text that you think should not be included in the literary canon and indicate why, or to identify a performance or text that you think has contemporary relevance and indicate why, or identify performance or text that you think does not have contemporary relevance and, of course, indicate why. Questions that don't really have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning. And that said, since it's due at the ending of the semester, there wouldn't necessarily be time to rewrite it, but I see the first paper as the learning exercise, where you get an opportunity to read my comments, and then if you so wanted to, you could do a revision, and you've got up until the ending of the semester in which to do that revision, but the sooner the better. And you would hand in that revision along with the original copy with my comments so I could compare and contrast the two. And I am hopeful that I will be caught up in the next week or two with that and with our attendance questions so that we can continue on with our very last unit of the semester after we're done with A Raisin in the Sun, and that will be poetry. And while you won't necessarily have time to write a paper about poetry, the bulk of our final exam will be on poetry. 80 points will be on poetry, 10 points on short story, 10 points on drama. And if we were taking this as a face-to-face class, you would have approximately 2 hours to take that final in an open book, open note format. And it would basically be a series of essay questions that you would get to choose from. We obviously are not taking this in a face-to-face format. We're taking this in an online format. So you would have 24 hours in which to complete that final. Not that I would expect you to spend 24 hours working on it. I would expect you to spend approximately 2 hours or so, give or take a bit, working on it. And I know it won't be as polished or as well developed as anything that you would do for, let's say, a paper, but I wouldn't expect that. Nevertheless, I would expect that you're able to express yourself with an introduction, a body, conclusion, and that you're able to synthesize some of the major points. The best way to basically prepare for the final is to have done all of the reading, to have watched all of the class videos, especially the poetry section, because the bulk of the final is the poetry section. And also to read all the class discussion forum responses and my responses in turn. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And again, if all goes well, I should be able to catch up in the next week or so that you've got responses to your discussion forums, and all of you or most of you would have gotten your first paper back with the option of revising it. So where we are is talking a little bit about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we saw Performance by Hoffman in 1999, an $11 million budget, and it earned over $16 million in the box office, so it earned a nice profit. Not huge, but nice. It was filmed in 1998 on location in Italy, and I think you could see that with some of those majestic outdoor scenes. And some of the themes for us to consider in A Midsummer Night's Dream is that love makes everybody, regardless of their age or status, an idiot. And that's basically what we see in all of the couplings here. And at least Shakespeare's equal opportunity, so he's not necessarily suggesting that if one is of higher rank, let's say a king or a queen, that one is immune to the follies of love. Or that if one happens to be older, one is immune to the follies of love. Or if one even happens to be a supernatural being, such as a fairy, that one is immune to the follies of love, that we are all subject to the follies of love. And love can destroy friendships, which is exactly what we see with Hermia and Helena. That love is like a magical spell, and all of these characters act as if they are enchanted. It's one of the reasons why spellcraft is so important and magic in this play. That love is like a dream, and that's embedded within the title itself, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Think about how dreams are uncontrollable. Think about the language we use, that we fall asleep or we fall in love, and all of the negative associations with falling that can result in hurt or death. Certainly, it can result in embarrassment. I think all of that is embedded in there. That dreams have an ending, that dreams are fictional, and these perhaps are embedded messages about love as well. Dreams and love are things that can't be controlled. We learn through Helena and Hermia that beauty need not be tall and blonde, which was the stereotype of the time, which is what Helena is, tall and blonde, but that doesn't mean that she's got any suitors, at least at the beginning of the play. Obviously, that switches through Love Juice, but it's Hermia, the short brunette, which would not be seen by societal standards as the epitome of beauty, that has all of the attention. In fact, when we begin talking about poetry, we'll go back to Shakespeare and talk a little bit about his sonnets, his poetry writing, where in a series of his sonnets, they're written to someone known as the Dark Lady. And this would have been a woman that had dark features, not necessarily dark skin, but dark hair and dark eyes, which again would not have reinforced the expectation of beauty during the time period. Yet Shakespeare spent his time talking about her beauty in his poetry. So we could see how Shakespeare was very subversive in some respects, considering his time period. Within the play, we see females defying male figures and actually getting their way by the ending of the play. I think that's even more interesting. The idea that Hermia can defy her father, and she would have been seen as a piece of property. And at the ending, she gets her way and her father doesn't. And yes, it's true that Titania tries to defy Oberon and doesn't want to give the changeling boy over. She's humiliated and embarrassed by Oberon and distracted. Another element about love, that when you're in love, that things that used to be important to you no longer are. And of course, Oberon takes the changeling, so we can't say that she gets her way. Helena is complex in that she definitely comes off as quite passive, and she tells Lysander, treat me like your dog. You know, she definitely is, in modern day terminology, stalker. But as she says, women were not made to woo, and yet she is taking the active role of pursuer and does get her way at the ending of the play. don't know if we see this necessarily as a positive ending. It is for her, I suppose. I don't know about Demetrius, but keep in mind that Demetrius and Helena had been a couple prior to the play. So the way it would have been seen in the the Renaissance is that it was a restoration of order. So that would have been a happy ending, so to speak. And, of course, we've got women like Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. And, yes, she is defeated by Theseus. So that doesn't necessarily show female power. But we do see the idea of perhaps a happy union in that by the ending of the play, the assumption is that everyone will live happily ever after. And there is an affection that's developing between the two. And that political union, whether it be for social or for economic reasons, was not that unusual during the Renaissance. Virginity is so important for female during this time period, and yet the play is set in midsummer, and midsummer being a pagan holiday that was associated with fertility and specifically sexual union. And this is the longest day of the year on June 21st. There also is reference at the ending of the play to May Day. This is another summer or another pagan holiday that also is associated with the idea of sexual union. So we get continual references to sexuality in this play, even though we're supposed to assume that the lovers remain virginal. I think it's one of the problems with the Hoffman film version that we saw is that the assumption is by the ending of the play that they've consummated their relationships, even though they have not technically married yet. We know that love is blind, and we see that through Hippolyta, that she literally and figuratively, Titania, that she literally and figuratively falls in love with Bottom the ass. Bottom being on the lowest rung of the chain of being or social standing, but he also acts like a bottom. And the wink and the nod in this play is that the donkey or the ass would have been thought to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom here. So there'd be some sexual, some body humor in that as well. In terms of writing, and this could be a class in and of itself. And as I had indicated, I'm teaching a Shakespeare class if you are interested in learning more about Shakespeare. Next semester, that is. The writing is quite poetic. You will see a use of rhyme where the ending of words sound the same. You will see uses of alliteration where the beginnings of words sound the same. You will see iambic pentameter where lines will have a meter, a sound to them. Specifically, it'll sound like ba-bum, 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 stressed and unstressed. It sounds like a heartbeat. And in fact, there have been some scholars that have theorized that one of the reasons why Shakespeare's language is so appealing to the ear is because it mimics the sound we probably all would have first heard when we were in the womb, our mother's heartbeats. And iambic pentameter goes even further by giving us a 10-syllable line. So something like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is very deliberately 10 syllables, and we'll revisit this when we talk about Shakespeare's sonnets. The difference between verse and prose. Verse happens to be poetry, and prose happens to be complete sentences. The idea is that the lower orders would speak prose, the complete sentences, and the higher orders would speak verse or poetry. But Shakespeare could mix that up a little bit and make commentary about people's station in life without being very explicit, just through the use of language that they use. So if you have a lower level character who's speaking in verse or in poetry, then that shows a certain level of refinement that maybe you wouldn't expect from a lower level character. If you see a higher level character speaking in prose or complete sentences, that could signify that there is a descent in that character, in perhaps their morality or in their intellect. So there's a lot of things going on with language, and I just wanted to point out a few quotes to you. And you can see that I've started this in the notes below in the third section. In Act 1, expect a lot of wit from Shakespeare. So one of my favorite lines is in Act 1, Scene 1, like line 93 through 94. Notice I'm not referencing page number because you don't need to reference page number with Shakespeare the way you do with other quotation, because Shakespeare's plays are divided into act, scene, and line. So regardless of which version or which edition of Shakespeare you're reading, it will always be the same act, scene, and line. So we don't have to rely on page number. That said, we can't do that with Oedipus the King. Oedipus the King is a translation, so the acts and the lines won't necessarily exactly transfer over. And for Raisin in the Sun, it's not necessarily divided into act, scene, and line, so that's something else that we can't do. But we can do that with Shakespearean and Renaissance dramas Shakespeare wrote during the Renaissance, which means rebirth, renewal. It was a time of great artistry, in part because Queen Elizabeth supported the arts. Fortunately for us, because that was so important for particularly theater, which is seen as, or was seen as, a kind of lowbrow activity, that the Queen offered her political support so that they could continue with performing plays. We do learn a little bit of backstory through the characters' dialogue. Remember, everything has to be given to us through dialogue because we are reading or watching a drama. And Lysander, at one point, in Act 1, Scene 1, line 107, says Demetrius had made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. What he means by that is that Demetrius had wooed Helena, not that he literally made love or had sexual relations with her. Again, very important that she retain her virginity, or else she would be seen as damaged goods during the time. At one point, Act 1, Scene 1, line 134, Lysander says, the course of true love never did run smooth. Very famous line, and also one of the more important morals of the play itself. Now, one of the things Shakespeare likes to do is to show his contrast between his abilities as opposed to the abilities of others, and that his abilities are superior. So, right in the first act, we get shown poor rhyme in contrast to well-written rhyme. And the well-written rhyme, which goes to show how it's so natural that it helps to forward the plot as well, or at least the example I wanted to give you. There are many examples. Act 1, Scene 1, line 202, where Hermia says, take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he had turned a heaven unto a hell. Now, an example of bad rhyme would occur shortly thereafter, and this is Bottom. This is when he's rehearsing the play Pyramus and Thisbe. And even though his rhyme has, or his poetry has rhyme, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has any level of superiority. The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates. Act 1, Scene 2, 31 through 38. And even after that, he says, oh, this was lofty. So in other words, he's praising himself to show his arrogance. But what he's just indicated, or even though it rhymes, is nonsense. It would be similar to saying roses are red, violets are blue, sugar's sweet, and so are you. So as simple as Hermia's rhyme might be, it forwards the plot and it makes sense in a way that Bottom's rhyme could never do just because of its absurdity. So in Act 2, we learn about the power dynamics in love, that oftentimes love is about power struggles. And Titania says, I have forsworn his bed and company. And basically she's talking about Oberon, that she's denying him relations at this point because they're arguing about the changeling boy. Now, at one point, Oberon says something very odd. Act 2, Scene 1, line 186. He says, I am invisible. This is not for the characters. This is for us as audience, that we're supposed to know that fairies are invisible to the other actors on stage or the other characters on stage. Therefore, he's telling us that he's now become invisible, so the other characters are going to act as if they can't see him. So understand that sometimes you've got some rather artificial conventions in drama in order to be able to explain plot to audience. Things that you wouldn't necessarily have to do in, let's say, film. Though we did watch a film performance where they were able to do things such as have special effects. Threats. Demetrius says in Act 2 to Helena, if thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood. Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 through 237. What he's just said is that if Helena continues to pursue him, he will take her virginity. Again, another piece of evidence to illustrate that she is a virgin and the importance of virginity. And Helena's response, which is about gender, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 or so, is, your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed, and we're not made to woo. The idea that a woman should not take the role of pursuer, and yes, she's reduced to doing that. So in that way, perhaps you can see a certain level of strength to her character. Now, Act 3, and we've talked a little bit about how Shakespeare's plays are in a pyramid structure, so that at the left-hand side of the pyramid at the bottom would be Act 1, where we're introduced to characters. Moving up the pyramid on the left-hand side would be Act 2, so we're getting an increase in conflict. And then the very top of the pyramid, this would be Act 3. This would be the height of conflict. And then Act 4 and Act 5 on the right side of the pyramid would be the beginning of descent and then closure. So we're at Act 3, so we're expecting the height of conflict. We also get a moral, and it's quite ironic that it comes from bottom of all people. Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 to 144. Reason and love keep little company nowadays. And that said, perhaps Bottom is able to make that reflection because he is the only character who's not involved in a love relationship, at least prior to the play. We know that he's manipulated, or I should say that Titania is manipulated through Love Juice to love him, and he goes with it. Another moral, and this is from Puck, and Puck is not involved in any love relationship at all, either before the play or during the play. So perhaps he has enough reason and rationality to be able to state in Act 3, Scene 2, line 115, what fools these mortals be. And I would argue that it's not just the mortals, the fairies as well are quite foolish. The insults fly fast and furious. Helena, for instance, calls Hermia, her former best friend, who is now her best enemy, because they're arguing over men, is you puppet, you bead, you acorn, you. These are all references to being short, the small stature that Hermia has. But of course, puppet also implies that she's being controlled or manipulated by somebody else. Another insult Hermia gives to Helena, her former best friend, you painted maypole. Act 3, Scene 2, line 296. This is a particularly brutal insult, particularly if you understand May Day. May Day is that pagan day in which you would celebrate fertility and sexual union. And the maypole, which people would dance around as part of the celebration, was supposed to be a phallic symbol. So basically, by calling Hermia, or by Hermia calling Helena a maypole, she just suggested that Helena is a phallus, and the idea that she's painted would be, this is what loose women do, they're strumpets, they basically use makeup in order to seduce and to trick others into a sexual union. So this is a rather pointed and deep insult. Think how quickly love turns into hate when a former lover becomes an Ethiop, which we hear in Act 3, Scene 2, line 258. Away, you Ethiop, is what's said to Hermia. Now remember, Hermia has dark hair and dark eyes, so the assumption is that she's being made reference to Ethiopia in this instance. And to illustrate how the hate continues, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 268, Lysander continues saying, shall I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead? So his first go-to position is, well, perhaps I should kill her. So again, illustrating that old cliche, how thin that line is between love and hate. And Lysander says, Get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 through 329. Now, if this were a tragedy, the lovers would actually come to blows, but we know it's a comedy, so that we need to have a resolution, which is what we're going to get in Act 4. And what's kind of unusual about this Act 4 is that it seems as if the play proper itself reaches its conclusion in Act 4, and that Act 5 is tacked on, but nothing is ever done accidentally or coincidentally by Shakespeare. Act 5 is just as important as the other acts because it'll serve as a mirror to what we've just seen. But in Act 4, we will get our resolution, and we know that Bottom is going to need to remove the love juice from one of the men, so that ultimately Lysander goes back to loving Hermia. Hermia, again, maybe we have to suspend some disbelief, is willing to forgive Lysander for everything. We know that Demetrius remains with love juice so that he loves Helena, and of course Helena loves Demetrius. Again, I don't know what it says that Demetrius doesn't have free will, but Demetrius did love Helena prior to the play, so perhaps that is a restoration, a proper restoration of order. We know that Bottom needs to be returned to human form. That doesn't mean that he's no longer a figurative ass. He's just not a literal ass. We know that Queen Titania will have the love juice removed from her eyes, so she sees her folly, and she's lost the changeling boy and seems to be fine with that. Again, perhaps we have to accept or suspend some disbelief. And this is where Theseus, remember, needs to make a decision about the lovers. And he's decided that he's going to overbear Aegeus's will. This is in Act 4, Scene 1, line 179. At this point, it seems that the four lovers, Hermia and Lysander and Helena and Demetrius, are content. So this seems to be the best of all possible worlds, and that the only person who's going to be upset is Aegeus. And then Bottom says, again, I think it's so interesting that this comes out of Bottom's mouth. Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, man is but an ass. And of course, that's humorous and ironic because he himself was a literal ass, but it also serves as a great kind of commentary or moral for the play. And a piece of dialogue that would seem to be completely meaningless is actually quite meaningful. In Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 through 100. And now we've got basically Theseus and Hippolyta speaking to one another and talking about the play that's going to be performed for them to entertain them. And what they're discussing is that how sometimes their subjects don't necessarily greet them with the proper amount of respect. And this is the response from Theseus to Hippolyta about that. Where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, in conclusion dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome. In other words, what Theseus is saying is that he thinks that this is not an insult. In fact, it's an honor, that individuals would think so highly of them that they literally become tongue-tied and are not able to give them a proper greeting. And the way that this is seen as a tribute to the queen is that it was assumed that the queen would be in the audience, and she would, of course, relate to the royalty that would be presented in the play. So when Theseus is saying that he acts with that kind of grace and that kind of dignity, the assumption is that the queen would think of herself and say, I'm a similar kind of ruler, and I do the same thing. I act with that grace and dignity. Not a bad idea to compliment the queen, considering how many harsh statements about love were made and how all of us, regardless of station, regardless of gender, regardless of education, regardless of age, are all basically idiots when it comes to love. Of course, in Act 5, we get the play within a play. It's a hilarious play. A lot of physical humor. I always think of I Love Lucy, actually, if you've ever seen that show. So watching it performed is so important. And also, we have a mirror on what we've just seen. So this is a play about love, because we have seen a play about love. And it should remind you of Romeo and Juliet, which is thought to have been written around the same time, even though we think that the early part of Shakespeare's career was mostly devoted to comedies, and then histories, and then finally tragedies, and then the tragic comedies before his retirement Again, we're not exactly sure when he wrote the plays, and at least based on the scholars have done, it wasn't as if he wrote all of his comedies first and then moved into another genre that sometimes he'd mix and match. So this was quite clever of Shakespeare. Either Romeo and Juliet had already been performed, so audiences would know that play and watch Pyramus and Thisbe and see just how absurd it is compared to the greatness of Romeo and Juliet. Or this was a way for Shakespeare to advertise the Romeo and Juliet play that would be coming out shortly thereafter, so that audiences could keep Pyramus and Thisbe in mind and its absurdity when they watch the quality of Romeo and Juliet. And it also provides an opportunity to make a statement about lack of insight. Hippolyta at one point says in Act 5, Scene 1, line 210, "This is the silliest stuff I ever heard." And of course, all of the humans are watching this play, and Pyramus and Thisbe, and they're laughing and they think it's absurd, because it is. I mean, what we see is bad acting and bad writing and just a bad performance in general. This is a way for Shakespeare to critique his competition, in fact, rather than directly critiquing them, just showing us the kind of nonsense that they would produce in contrast to his great work. But the lack of insight from Hippolyta, because she herself and all of the others watching this play had been equally ridiculous just a couple of acts earlier, and they never once see the parallels with their own behavior. But the real message is for us as audience, that if we are watching A Midsummer Night's Dream or a Pyramus and Thisbe within A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we never stop to think about our own absurdity when it comes to love, how we've all acted, for lack of a better word, like an ass, how we've all been blind in love, that we have all fallen in love with asses, then we've learned nothing from the play. Don't think that Shakespeare isn't above making a sex joke if he has the opportunity to do it, which is what we get in Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. I remember the first time that this was brought to my attention, and I was an undergraduate student, so I don't take credit, nor do I take blame for this. And this is when Thisbe is talking. And Thisbe's talking to the wall and say, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. The way that line is oftentimes read is that "my cherry lips have often kissed thy stones," stones being testicles, and "thy stones with lime and hair," that being pubic hair. In other words, this is a reference to oral sex. Considering everything that's going on in this play, and we haven't even talked about the idea of a human falling in love with an animal, which I suppose we could say is what Titania is. I mean, Titania is a fairy, but she is in human form, and she falls in love with an ass. So outside of all of these ways that someone could be offended by watching this play, it makes a lot of sense that we would have an ending apology. This is put in the character of Puck. Puck is a kind of master manipulator in this play. He's controlling and manipulating the action, and he oftentimes has been seen as a kind of Shakespeare character. And you have to think about, too, the idea of who has power. It's supposed to be that, Puck's master, so to speak. Fairy Oberon is the one that's controlling things, but Oberon is basically giving Puck directions. It's Puck who's actually enacting things. I always think of modern day parallels about, let's say, the workplace, where, let's say, the head of the organization, the CEO, happens to not be present that day, and work continues just fine. But when the administrative assistant, who is supposed to be lower in the hierarchy, is absent, then, things come to a halt. And I wonder how much could have been done without Puck's ability to basically enact action. So Puck is oftentimes seen as a kind of Shakespeare, and also is seen as a kind of commentary of servitude and mastery, if Oberon is supposed to be the master and Puck is supposed to be the servant. And we see how that's usurped several times in the play, especially when Puck decides to act on his own and maybe, or maybe not, commits a mistake with the love juice. Probably one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, if we shadows have offended. And, you know, the idea of referencing themselves as shadows, because that's really what actors are. They're just kind of like images. They're not real. It also influences the idea of dark and light in this play, which is also another theme. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here. You know, so just pretend that this is just a dream, a weak and idle dream. This wasn't real. This was fiction. And at one point, Puck says, if you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest Puck. The problem is Puck is not honest. Puck is anything but honest. So we have to wonder if this, quote, apology, unquote, is truly sincere, because Puck is dishonest, not honest. And if we have unearned luck to escape the serpent's tongue, this is where it's helpful to read an edition of Shakespeare where you've got some footnotes, which you do in your text. Serpent's tongue is defined for you as hissing. Would be the serpent's tongue. So he's basically asking audiences not to boo and hiss. And also he says, give me your hands if we be friends. The idea of giving me your hands, applause he's asking for. And that said, you know, having a Puck at the end apologize just in case somebody is offended, and I think everybody could be offended. And you could see this apology serving on a number of levels. This could be the character of Puck apologizing. This could be the actor playing Puck apologizing. This could be Shakespeare through the actor, through the character apologizing. But when the actor or the character or Shakespeare says, so good night unto you all, basically this is our cue that things are going to be ending, you know, that it's time for us to leave. And he references himself as Robin Goodfellow as well. And notice that he goes by two names. He goes by Puck and Robin Goodfellow. It's very similar to having a full name and a nickname as well. So those were just some of the quotes that I wanted to reference in terms of A Midsummer Night's Dream. As you know, the next play is going to be A Raisin in the Sun. I think you'll find it to be a much easier read because it's more contemporary and it's set in the United States. That is the play that is not included in our textbook, which I had ordered as a separate text, but I was also able to find a link online in which you could access the text, and you can see that in the notes below, so in the 8th section. So at this point, you should have finished reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, and you should be in the midst of A Raisin in the Sun, but as you know, we will talk about performance as well as talk about the play itself. So as I had indicated, paper number 2, you can see the topics listed in the syllabus and other documents folder. This is in the 9th section, but I've already talked about this a little bit, about how you could talk about either performance or the text and whether or not that in one way or another should be in the literary canon, should not be in the literary canon, does have contemporary relevance or does not have contemporary relevance. So basically you've got 6 options here: the performance of Oedipus and the text of Oedipus, the performance of Midsummer and the text of Midsummer, and finally the performance of Raisin and the text of Raisin. So out of one of those 6, talking about either canon or talking about contemporary relevance, or you can create your own essay topic. Just make sure you get the topic approved by me. So for our attendance question, which will be due on the 15th, and as I indicated, my intention is to catch up with our attendance questions as well as the papers shortly. So that will perhaps help you in terms of making a determination how to proceed with your paper. Because again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses and ultimately my responses in turn. So that might perhaps give you an idea for the second paper. But your attendance question, which would be due on the 15th, and if you need additional time, please let me know. What did you find to be the most surprising thing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising thing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? And as usual, there are no right or wrong answers here. I'm just more interested in your reasoning pattern. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on with drama next class. Take care. Bye-bye.